Does it work? Hello, hello, is it working? Streaming quality is excellent, apparently. So I can go back and... Oops, sorry.
Well done! Right, hello everyone. Welcome for coming through the second deluge to get here. It really is quite incredible, the weather outside. This is a slightly ad hoc, it's an inaugural meeting. The whole thing has come up for everybody pretty quickly. So we're trying to do the best we can to take you through what we know and the state of the play as it is. First, before I start that, because the hall's pretty full, I just need to do some safety announcements. There are 3 exits in case the building catches fire. One over there, one over here, and at the back. I think probably unlikely with the deluge, but I have to point that out. Toilets at the back on the side. And then we have only 2 hours, which is very little time for the amount of stuff we have to cover. We're planning to have a break in the middle, which also will give you a chance to sign up if you want to keep up to date with what's going on. We need your email addresses and phone numbers. So there's tables at the back, so if you haven't given those in, please do so. We're going to start off with Daisy giving an intro of the complicated history from the beginning to the current state. It'll be a summary. Then Larry will talk about some of the rail issues, and I will then come and just take you quickly through what the geography of the rail freight terminal and some photos that I've taken at another site to give you an idea of what it may look like. If we can keep the questions generally and the discussion to after the break, when we can then go in different places, different things, and then look at how we can best work to try and to persuade Herts County Council not to sell the land, because if they don't sell the land, this cannot go ahead. Okay, Daisy.
Thank you very much, Neela. Good afternoon, everybody, and Happy New Year. First of all, let me say thank you to the organisers, to Nuala, to Shirani, to Gary, and I'm sure many others. It's brilliant that you put this event together. I'm going to start by saying that I know there are some people in the room who have been dealing with this issue for 20 years. There are other people in this room who've only been dealing with it for the last couple of months. So I'm going to give a very potted history, which is not going to be the complete full history. Others can wax lyrical about that, either in the break or possibly down the pub. But I'm going to give a potted history to try and bring everybody up to speed to explain what's been happening. So in my presentation, I'm going to speak in 2 halves. The first half is about the history of the site and about questions about planning permission and separately about land ownership, because the 2 things are separate. Then in the second half, I'm going to talk about the future and possible options in terms of what might happen to this particular site. So I'll try and keep it reasonably structured. So let me start with the issue of planning. Now, St Albans District Council and Hertfordshire County Council have always been opposed to this proposed development. They have consistently opposed having a strategic rail freight interchange on this site. It was in 2012 when a company put in an application to build the freight terminal on this site, and it was refused by St Albans District Council. Hertfordshire County Council made a comment on that application, and they too were against this development. The developers appealed that refusal in 2014, and the Secretary of State at the time, Mr. Eric Pickles, just... Panto season's over.
Why is it always a
But
guy
he is
called
the villain.
Pickles?
So one Eric Pickles decided to determine the application himself. He could have left it to the planning inspector to look at it, but he didn't. He called in the application so that he himself could make that decision. Now, I'm very aware, and people do continue to email me about this, that there were allegations at the time about potential alleged improper lobbying, but I do not have parliamentary privilege to repeat any of that today, so I'm not going to go there. But again, at the break or down the pub, you can listen to that if you wish. But that's basically what happened. The Secretary of State made that decision in 2014. Since I was elected in 2019, and before I was elected, but during and since I was elected, I have campaigned consistently to try and stop this development from going ahead. Since I was elected, I have raised the issue on 5 separate occasions in Parliament and secured a debate specifically on the freight terminal in September 2020. Now, there are lots of different reasons, very valid planning considerations as to why many of us think it shouldn't happen and shouldn't go ahead. The location is not ideal, and those of you who have been around for a long time will know that under the previous Labour government, a Labour Secretary of State actually declined to have a freight terminal here because of the location. Traffic congestion and noise. We know that there's going to be a lot of HGV lorries going in and out of this site if it goes ahead, and yet there seems to be this idea that it's not going to impact our area when it clearly will. There's concern about the impact that it will have not just in Park Street, but on all of the neighbouring villages and settlements. We know, for example, that in London Coney, there are already problems with lorries that park up on the verges overnight. Not only does it destroy the verges, it can create real hazards on the road, and it can bring antisocial behaviour with it too. So we're worried that that might happen as well. There's also the loss of Greenbelt. There's questions about capacity on the rail network, which I know Larry is going to address. And there's a real genuine issue, which is that the government has issued a top-down housing target for our district council of building 14,000 homes, and that number will not be reduced even if this freight terminal goes ahead. So it's enormous pressure in terms of the infrastructure that our local area is expected to build. Now, all of these concerns are valid for us as residents. All of them are. But in terms of the planning process, these concerns about planning would only have been relevant before the Secretary of State decided to give planning permission to the freight terminal to go ahead. Because he has now given planning permission, the next issue is about the sale of the land. Now, some of you might know this, some of you may not, but there's this curious thing in planning law where I can apply for planning permission on my next door neighbour's house. I can pay a developer to draw up some beautiful plans. I can put the application into the council can debate it, they can give me planning approval, but of course I can't go through with that planning permission unless the next door neighbour sells me their land. And that's a really important thing to remember, because the planning concerns are very different from the legal position over the ownership of the land. Give me 1 second. Right, so we're now going to deal with the ownership of the land. Now, the position since 2014, since the Secretary of State made this decision, was that the future of this site is in the hands of the landowner. And there are 3 landowners. There's Hertfordshire County Council, there's Gorhambury Estate, and there's Tarmac. Now, right now, there is a key legal question. There is a point of legal contention, which is, are the landowners legally obliged to sell the land or not? It's a point of legal contention. Hertfordshire County Council has always claimed that it is a reluctant seller. That's the phrase it continues to use. We're a reluctant seller, we've never wanted this, we don't want to sell our land. But they have continued to say that they are obliged to sell it. However, every other freight interchange around the country has been built because the government issued a development consent order. and a DCO, as it's known, basically forces the landowners to sell the land. There is no development consent order for this particular site. The Hertfordshire County Council has also said, and this is all on record in some of their recent meetings, that they don't want to, and I quote, thwart the will of the Secretary of State. Well, the Secretary of State has made it clear in letters to some of you, who I know have written to him, but also in a debate that I held in Parliament, that it is for the landowners to decide. So, Hertfordshire County Council says that it has procured legal advice on a number of different occasions. I have submitted, I've requested that legal advice to be published a number of times. I have now resorted to submitting 2 Freedom of Information requests because the leader of the council and the council as a whole has refused to publish the legal advice upon which they are relying to make their decision. However, at a recent meeting, some of you will know that Andy Love, who I don't believe is here, but Andy and Nuala set up a petition. I think many of you signed it, and we got to the relevant number of signatories that petition was debated at Hertfordshire County Council. And the points that were made, and because of the petition, the leaders of the council invited Nuala and Andy and myself to have a meeting with them before the petition was presented. Now, whilst they continue to refuse to publish the legal advice, they were prepared to tell us what the legal principles were upon which they were relying. So my office took those legal principles away and did some research and found out that they simply don't apply in this circumstance. I'm not going to go into the legal principles, but if anybody wants to know what they are, drop me an email and we can send you the letter. But it's quite boring, but it's so important. Anyway, as a result of that meeting, and as a result of Nuala presenting that petition to Hertfordshire County Council, Hertfordshire County Council has now agreed it is going to get new legal advice. I have now written to Hertfordshire County Council and said, I'm glad you're getting new legal advice. Will you promise to publish it? For anybody in the room who wants to ask, what can I do as a result of today's meeting, write to your county councillor, write to the leader of the council, and demand that that legal advice, when it is secured, is published, because we need to see it. So hopefully, all of that makes sense. That is as concise a summary as I can produce as to where we are at today. I'm going to very briefly just touch on the next steps in terms of what happens next and the different potential scenarios. Fundamentally, there are 2 things that can happen. The first scenario is that Hertfordshire County Council and the other landowners decide that they do want to sell the land. They might pretend, they might have legal advice saying they're reluctant sellers, they might decide they want to sell it anyway because they want the cash, but there's one scenario in which Hertfordshire County Council sells the land. If they do, we can't really, there's actually no levers left to stop it from happening. And at that stage, it all comes down to the planning conditions which were attached to the initial application that the Secretary of State approved in 2014. Now, there's a very, very long list of planning conditions that the developer must meet when they are building this particular site. And I think Nuala possibly is going to touch on them in more detail, but the ones that really matter are conditions 4 to 7, where the Secretary of State, when he made his decision, said the developers can build the freight terminal before they make any improvements to the Park Street roundabout and the other roads, but they can't actually use the freight terminal until those works are done. The concern for us is we know they've tried to ignore those conditions in another part of the country, and Nuala will talk about that, I'm sure, in a minute. So even though those conditions are attached, there is no guarantee that the developer will try and stick to them. And those of you who know anything about planning know that enforcement of planning conditions is incredibly hard. First of all, it's done after the event, so you have to wait until somebody breaches their conditions. And then it's a David and Goliath fight, because you've got a small district council with not very much money and very few planning officers having to take on a massive company making a massive £1 million investment. It can be done, but it's difficult. The other option, or the other scenario, I would say, is that Hertfordshire County Council decides not to sell the land. If they decide not to sell the land, and I should say all 3 landowners would have to sell their land for the freight interchange to go ahead, and all 3 of them, it would be a contractual decision that all 3 of them would sell together, or all 3 of them won't sell at all. That's the interrelationship there. But if Hertfordshire County Council decides not to sell the land, it's possible that the company, Segro, could launch a legal challenge and try and force them somehow. It depends what legal advice Hertfordshire County Council had had. It's possible that the government could seek a development consent order to force the landowners to sell the land. Now, if the government does decide to go down that route to try and compel the landowners to sell the land, the development consent order requires us to go through the whole planning permission process again, which means that all of the concerns that we collectively have about traffic and noise and disruption and greenbelt and housing targets, all of those issues could be raised again at that stage, right? So not before, but at that stage it could. The other alternative is if the government, so if Hertfordshire County Council doesn't sell the land, and if the government doesn't seek a development consent order, then the land reverts to being greenbelt land. And there's a very clear government procedure about what local councils have to do with greenbelt land in terms of how you assess them. There isn't an option for residents to say, well, we want this on it, or we want that on it, or we want it for this purpose. There are very clear rules in planning terms about how greenbelt should be assessed for a future purpose. It is possible that St Albans District Council would look at the land and be compelled under the greenbelt rule to look at a bit of the land and say, could any of it be suitable for housing, and some of it maybe, some of it may not be, then that's the whole next thing. But in terms of dealing with the freight interchange, hopefully that gives you a kind of overall view of the planning history, the current fight, which is about the legal advice and whether the landowners are legally compelled to sell the land or not. Nope. I believe they are not, but Hertfordshire County Council claims that they are, and we'll see what the new legal advice says. And then depending on how that unfolds, we then have the question about what happens next and the different scenarios. So hopefully those who have been around for 20 years are not too bored, because they know this already. And those of you who have been around for a couple of months, hopefully now have a clearer picture of what's happened. And I'll leave it there, but very happy to take questions when we get to that bit. Thank you, Nuala.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be very brief, but just wanted to give you a little bit of background as to how I've got involved in this. 4 years ago, I retired from Gobia Thameslink Railway at the end of my railway career, and I live in St Albans. I've been here now for 35 years, so it's a subject that I've always been passionately interested in. I was involved going back to 2007, 2008, in the original planning application and the original appeal by Helios Slough, as they were known then, which was refused. And with a colleague at what was then First Capital Connect, we put together the objections and our concerns. In principle, we had no objection to the concept of rail freight interchanges. In fact, First Capital Connect was part of First Group. Also part of First Group was First GP Rail Freight, which by definition was in the business of moving rail freight, including up and down the Midland Main Line. The concern was essentially how the structure of the interchange and its use could negatively impact on the services that passengers would get along the Midland Main Line. And there were two key issues which were very well summarised back in March 2017 by a magazine called Modern Railways, which is read by many rail professionals. And I'm going to read you that because I think it summarises probably better than I would what the issues were seen as being. So first of all, a dive under is to be built, it said, as part of work to connect the new Radlett strategic rail freight interchange to the Midland Main Line. The terminal will be on the west side of the Midland Main Line, sandwiched between that line and the Watford to St Albans Abbey branch off at Park Street, with an access route under the Midland Main Line to join the slow lines on the east side of the formation. The next stage in the development work for the interchange is the creation of a plan for the building works required, which according to Network Rail would be the responsibility of developer Ilias Slough Limited. Network Rail has tentatively concluded that services to and from the interchange up to 24 paths per day, 12 in each direction, will not have a noticeable impact on passenger services on the Midland Main Line. During the peak periods, the railway would be entirely reserved for passenger services. As well as a connection to the site, work to increase the loading gauge is required to allow the largest containers to operate. This will necessitate adjustments to Elstree and Belsize tunnels, Belsize being between West Hampstead and Kentish Town. The level of disruption of these works the likely to cause is generally unclear. It's presently unclear. Well, what I can tell you is that we assessed the disruption for the track bed to be lowered as a closure of approximately 4 to 6 weeks. Now, what I'm going to do, because I'm really anxious to do everything I can to support the community to get the right result on this, if at all possible, is to approach the editorial team at this Modern Railways magazine and ask them if they could do an update on where they see things effectively 7 years later than the previous article. Because I understand that Network Rail are saying that the works that require the larger high cube boxes to go through these tunnels has already been done, so there is no issue anymore. Some people are saying, well, it's not 12 trains a day in and out, it's only potentially 4 or 5. Well, commercially, it's unlikely to be viable if it was only that. So I am going to move that forward and see if we can get a response. And I'm also going to do everything I can to support Daisy to make sure that every claim in relation to the rail capacity is very carefully looked at and challenged to make sure that we get the correct, truthful information. Thank you.
Hello. We're having to improvise on a pointer at the moment. I just want to take you, for those who have very little idea, like I did just a few months ago, of what is actually being proposed geographically and where things are. I just want to take you through those. And just also to state that we are really quite different from every other strategic rail freight interchange. We're half the size, the proposal is half the size of the others, which already would have economic and viability questions around it. We are also the only one that has no direct link onto a motorway system, and that our link to the main line is far trickier and far more difficult than any of the others that I've seen. But here we go. For those who can't see, we've got the M25 going on the bottom, the North Orbital over there, which is nearly 100 years old, dual carriageway, and is beginning to creak at the seams with the traffic. And you've got the North Orbital, the 405 going down there, the what used to be the M10, the 414 going up to Hemel there, junction 22 on the M25 here, junction 21A here. They have been told right from the beginning that they will never get a link onto the M25. And the reason being, this is where the rail freight terminal is proposed. The reason being, if you have a junction here, it's going to tail back and block junctions 21A and 20 and 21, the M1 turn-off. That would create such chaos that it's never, ever going to be allowed. Although I suspect that they probably hoped that it might be. All right, do you want to? Right, this is the plan. This is taken off their booklet, publicity booklet from November. This here is the Midland, the Thameslink line running down. This is where the old aerodrome was. Here is the Park Street roundabout there. This is the bridge going over the, that's the Abbey line. And the Watling Street is coming down here, Frogmore down to Colney Street. Knapsbury here, London Colney here. And then you've got Sopwell up above. The access points of this new plan are, the main one is going to be here, just to the west of Hedges Farm at the moment. It's going to be a dual roundabout, which goes over both sides of the current dual carriageway. And I suspect it'll be one of the first, if they do start building, it'll be one of the first things they have to build to create access. The other 2 points of access are down here. One which comes just by the start of the M25 road bridge there. And the other one by Haley and Vex, used to be known as the Red Lion pub. We don't quite know what they're intending for those. They have said that they will be narrowed to stop freight lorries going out. We don't know, they just said narrowed, so it also implies that they might be stopping freight lorries going in which case, yes, it may not be a very good bypass for for Park Street, and that's one of the big things they're trying to sell to us, that we're getting a bypass. The bypass is this route here. It just goes on the outside of the development, and there's another road that will go on the inside of the development to service the warehouses. Again, one of the things which is different from ours to any of the other sites that I visited is that we've got residential right up to the boundaries of the thing. All the others, they have villages, but we've got fields and woods and so on in between. So, for example, Northampton, you're at least a mile away from the developments. Right. The other thing that they keep on telling us that is a wonderful thing that they're giving us is that we're getting a country park. Anyone know what this is?
Frogmore Lakes.
It's the Frogmore Lakes, known as the Pits. One of the most misnamed things for one of it's one of the hidden jewels of the St Albans area. If any of you have not been, go. Pick a nice day when it isn't pouring with rain and go and walk around them. They are an absolute treasure. Yeah. I managed to live in St Albans for 20 years without knowing about them. And they are really beautiful. But we've had them for decades. And if you go beyond Hyde Lane, which is this lane here, you've got the moors, Skylark Meadows, beautiful. worth having. But we've had them for decades. Right.
Good
I think-
bond life.
Just lots of people have asked me about ownership of the land, and this is the first map I ever saw where the ownership was made clear. I don't know whether you can see the legend up here. Anything in red belongs to, it says Lafarge, but it's tarmac land. So all the red things here is all tarmac land. The blue ones is all Gorhambury land, and the green, which is really the site of the old aerodrome, is Herts County Council. And you can see how central Herts County Council land is for this. It's where pretty well all the warehouses will be. All right. Oh, if you can go back once, I've missed one crucial thing. Right, talking about what Larry was saying about the railway. The railway line will come off the Midlands Main Line, and it loops, that's it here, it loops here and does an extremely sharp curve.
Yikes.
And down, it's going to have one line that goes down the middle between the warehouses, and then it's got shunting and unloading lines here. And the train lengths are quite amazing that they're proposing. 3/4 of a kilometre long trains. That's what they're taking into East Midlands and to Northampton. That's what they're planning. So they are phenomenally long, and they're quite difficult. When I went up to Northampton to have a look at what was going on up there, they have to leave the Northampton loop there at 40 miles an hour, not less, not more. It's very, very specific, and it's really very difficult to take these enormously long, very heavy freight trains off. But that's something that Larry and anyone who's interested in maybe forming a working group on that can investigate more. Right, go on. And the next one. Right, these are just some photos I took on a visit up to East Midlands, which is up near, between sort of Derby and Nottingham, straight off the junction. These are what the warehouses will look like. They're flat roofed because they're planning to try and put solar panels on the roofs.
Mm-hmm.
That height there, which is the height that I think we've got, is 30 metres, and that's what they told us they were planning to do. 30 metres, that's over 100 feet high.
I can see you can
Big boxes. And you can see the height from the size of the lorries and the cabin, the containers. Again, and they're Helio Slough or Segro, which stands for Slough Estates Group. That's their colour. They do it in greys. So those of you who've gone up the M1 and have seen the blue ones up near Milton Keynes, it's the same sort of thing that's being built. What I also learned is that they build them, they let them first because they're all very, very customer specific. But Segro have agreed, the head of Segro went into an agreement with Amazon to provide Amazon with lots of warehouses across the country. David Sleeth, if you look at there's a Guardian article about that. And the first one here that in East Midlands that they put up was an Amazon. And from what the people in Northampton think, that's what they've heard is going to be the first one there. Yeah. And that's going to be the problem. It's just loads and loads of lorries. We, again, have very little detail on the HGV movements from this. There's a capping of 202 an hour in peak, the 2 peak hours in the morning and 2 peak in the evening. not really clear whether that's 202 in and out together or 202 in and 202 out. But that's what they've said about capping. Very little other detail. But then again, if we do go down the DCO things, that's stuff that we can and need to research, looking at ones that are already up and running. Okay, I think that's about it for a quick and dirty what's happening. It's now, is this a good time to take a break? Coming out of this meeting, we've a few of us, because we felt that this was so serious, and we've had wonderful support from Residents Association, individuals, a real eclectic group of us who care about this, and parish councils and so on have been very helpful. Keep Chiswell Green has kept me going, and we need support. We need people who are actively interested in trying to take this forward, because it has to be on a broader shoulders than just the few of us. So anyone who's interested, either come and see us or write down on one of the papers so that we can follow up, and as we want some takeaways. One of the, at the moment, as Daisy said, we are pursuing, the only line we can pursue is trying to persuade Herts County Council not to sell the land. The petition that Andy Love came up with was very helpful in getting debates and meetings. So it's possible we might look at doing another petition to try and get them to publish the legal advice and to not sell the land till that has been examined. And I think that may be a thing worth doing. Also, just keeping that we're the last, this meeting here, what you're doing is the last thing that Herts County Council want. They would prefer that we all disappeared and they could do it and sort out all the issues quietly with nobody looking, and then the first thing we'd know was when the bulldozers came in and so on. So we need to keep this issue boiling up, uncomfortable, so that it doesn't disappear. So any groups, any people who have got any skills, any contacts with media or press, any good ideas of things that we could do, again, the few of us can't come up with all the good ideas. I'm sure there's wonderful things there. Talked to one lady, her other half has a printer and who can print things for us. But any sort of talents or skills or things that you can offer us, please do. And do anyone want to say any more? No.
Take questions after the break.
We'll take questions after the break and then have a discussion. And any good ideas, welcome, very, very gratefully received. There's Joy and her tea at the back there, and there are plenty of biscuits. I went and raided Aldi. And I didn't just get plain biscuits.
Is there such thing as a plain biscuit?
So go and have a drink. Come and see us if you want. Please give us your emails and things, because with GDPR and things, we can't take things off other people. So we need the permission from you giving us your contact details so that we can, this is fast running. We know that they haven't sold the land yet, but we may only have something like 6-7 weeks before it might be concluded. So we have to act quickly and now. All right? Thank you. Daisy's saying back in 10 minutes, so quick rush for the loo and for things. Yeah, okay.
Well, if the live stream disconnects, I'll start it again. And you can watch part 2. Now! Crikey, man, like it. Look at all this. That is a long queue. Oh, sorry.
condition there is it has to be done before the units are occupied. Now, condition number 6 is the Park Street bypass. I mentioned there that they're talking about narrowing the southern end of it, which sort of implies that it's not actually going to be much of a bypass for Park Street. Again, it says no units to be occupied before the first phase is, and then phase 2, 230,000 square units can be occupied, but no more till they have finished the bypass. The improvements to junction 21A, again not specified, but know that that has to be done before any of the units are occupied. And number 8 is improvements to J22, again not specified, but to mitigate the impact of additional traffic. And you can have 130,000 square metres occupied before then. Somebody made a good point. For those of you who don't have great spatial awareness, 100 foot is double the width of this hall. So going upwards, it's this hall and another hall on top, just to give you an idea of quite how tall they are. And the bunds won't cover them completely. The bunds are these mounds, they're big earthworks. They cut down to create a flat surface, and all that land is then piled up around the side to supposedly reduce noise, light, and hide it. And they will plant them with trees, but they don't cover it completely. And I think number 10 was all about, condition 10 was about the rail freight. Now, most of these they're not allowed to let. Our conditions are mirror images of what's happening in Northampton, where they're not supposed to let or occupy any of the warehouses till the rail terminal is up and running. But in Northampton, they have found that they can't get the link up and running in time, so they've now appealed to the planning inspectorate to have those conditions waived, so that it will initially be a road hub. This has obviously made the residents there and Andrea Ledson, who's the MP, very, very angry about it. They are doing the connection. It seems that capacity is the problem there for the rail connection. But it shows that once the thing is up and running, is built, SEGRO are happy to try and get the conditions changed. And that's with a development consent order, which is a government thing, rather than Herts County, the St Albans District Council, which we are real minnow in face of a great white shark. We are going to be very much easier pushover for them on planning conditions than even a DCO. So I just wanted to make you aware of those things. Now, just before we start on to the questions, quite a lot of people have asked what we can do. Daisy said that we should write to our local county councillors for this area. Stella, is Stella here? All right, in the back. And for London Colney, it's Sarah Talon. Is Sarah here? Radlett is Caroline Clapper. So, if you just look up Google, you'll find who is your local councillor. Also write to Richard Roberts, who's the leader of the council and who's very much hands-on involved with this. The other person would be Bob Deering, who's in charge of the panel that's actually negotiating the deal. We're also thinking about a petition that could be very useful. The last one that Andy did was very helpful. So if you've given us your details, and we've got a few people who are expert on doing social media, we'll try and get details about that out. Again, any other ideas that you've got, welcome, and we will receive it, very gratefully. Somebody was asking us about funds. Yes, people have been very generous to try and get this up and running as it is, and thanks to St Stephen's Parish Council, we've got this hall for free for community use. Any donations would be gratefully received. The one problem we have is we haven't got a bank account at the moment, because this has all been arranged in such a hurry. Not quite sure how we deal with that yet. If there's any financial wizards around here, or anyone's got good ideas, please come and see us. But I think that's... so if people want to ask questions, anyone? If you could shout, because I think this mic... Oh, you've got a mic, all right.
Yes. People who know me know I don't need a microphone. I'm David Parry, I'm the parish councillor here. One thing, excellent presentation, Daisy. One thing you didn't mention in terms of trying to stop the county council selling is whether we could look at a judicial review of the decision the county council make. Now, a little bit about judicial reviews. If they are made by a district or parish council, then those authorities are liable if they lose them. And the amounts involved will be millions of pounds, so it is very unlikely that the council would take a judicial review. However, community groups can launch a judicial review without or with a limit on the costs that can be awarded against them of £35,000. And if that being the case, if we can have a community group that launches the judicial review against the county council's decision, then it can limit that cost, at least the cost against us. You'd still have the cost of going through the judicial review. St Stephen's Parish Council on Thursday agreed an initial amount of £10,000 to put in the budget towards any community group that it felt was going to do a judicial review. But we've only got 3 months from the decision on the 20th of December, I think it is, to launch a judicial review. So one thing I would ask the organisers is to whether a group can be formed that has a legal entity that can take advantage of that, because even if we fail, it's a good start and it is a good indication of intent that we are serious at stopping this.
Thank you very much. So I love judicial reviews. Before I was elected, I actually took the government to court and won. So I know quite a lot about judicial reviews. So for those who don't know about judicial reviews, first thing to say is a judicial review is a legal process that you can take once a decision has been made. I genuinely don't know whether it would come into effect when the Hertfordshire County Council decided that its intention was to sell the land, or when it would come in when the County Council had actually sold the land. Because at the moment, the Hertfordshire County Council has announced its intention to buy the land, but it hasn't actually sold it. So there's a little bit of a question about when that time period would kick in. The second thing to say about a judicial review is when you go to court, you allege that a public authority hasn't run the process correctly. You can't challenge the substance of a decision, only the process by which that decision was made. The third thing to say is it's set down in law that there are only 4 reasons why you can launch a judicial review. The language is sort of wide enough that you can normally crowbar something into one of those decisions, but you have to be able to show that that decision is either unreasonable or it didn't follow the correct course. So So all I would say is we would need to look at the process that Hertfordshire County Council used, and we would need to have grounds established that the process that was used was either incorrect in law, or that the process was unreasonable somehow because it didn't take due regard to something like cost or public purpose or something like that. And so we'd need to establish the legal grounds upon which we could take a judicial review. It's not blindingly obvious to me what those grounds could be, but certainly if anybody wants to do some digging and suggest them, I can look into them. So I don't think it's an obvious process that could be used, but certainly let's not rule it out 100%.
Whoopsie.
Has there been an archaeological survey of the site? Because I know in other cases that's completely stopped any building happening there because it could be anything.
Yeah. Good question. I'm not the expert on this. There'll be other people in the room who are. I doubt that there'll be anything there of archaeological value on the basis that it was used, obviously, as an aerodrome at some point, and therefore it's reasonably clear what has been there and what it's been used for. So I think it's unlikely, is all I'm going to say, not least because they're not really having to dig down, they're just building on top.
I spent 30 years in the contract design office, mechanical engineering, special purpose machinery, 15 years as a senior designer. During that time I've worked on over 100 projects. I've worked on projects the length and breadth of the country, Doonray in the north, Colwyn Bay in the west, telephone exchange on the south coast, Littlebrook Power Station in the east. I spent over 2 hours looking through the application when it was in the council office, and I got a distinct impression that they didn't actually want a rail freight terminal, but I couldn't figure out what they were after. There were so many mistakes in it. They showed the track between St Albans and Watford was shown as a full dual track railway. The original plan that they put in showed a hospital. By the time they put the plan in, that hospital had been demolished and replaced with a housing estate. Whenever I did a project, the thing to do is to go to the site because the drawings aren't always right. They didn't bother with that. There were too many mistakes in it. It was sloppy.
I mean, you're completely entitled to write to SEGRO and accuse them of being sloppy. I think that's totally within your right to say so. I mean, it's not unusual for developers when they're submitting a plan not to have everything drawn out precisely, often because they contract a company to do their planning, drawings that may not actually know the local area, or they'll just go off a map or something. So it's not completely unusual. The things that were in there would make a material difference to the decision that the Secretary of State made. In terms of the question about what else could be built there, I think this is a little bit of a rabbit warren that we shouldn't go down. There's been, I think because of the scale of opposition, quite rightly, to the freight interchange, lots of people have suggested that other things could be built there. So some people have suggested a hospital, some people have suggested housing, someone even suggested a solar farm. I mean, there's no shortage of ideas that people can come up with when faced with what do we want instead of a freight terminal. But that isn't the question that any of us can actually ask, because if the freight terminal doesn't go ahead, it's not a question of what else can we build. The purpose of the land reverts to being greenbelt land, and that attaches greenbelt status.
Horticultural.
And the area of greenbelt then has to be looked at on the same terms as every other bit of greenbelt land across the whole of the district.
Basically, let wildlife.
You pick whoever you like.
I don't know.
You get your steps in.
Have Gorhambury and Tarmac made it clear whether they plan to sell land or not?
Good question. So, there is an agreement between all three landholders that all three of them will either sell together or won't sell together. All three of them have been involved in negotiations with SEGRO on the sale of the land, so it's clear that they are taking part in that negotiation and are therefore working towards the idea of actually selling it. So clearly they have that intention. The other thing that somebody came and asked me during the break was that when you get planning permission, you have to fulfil some initial requirements within the first few years, within the first 4 or 5 years, and
and so SEGRO did take out some digging of the land in order to fulfil their planning permission, to keep that planning permission live. They did that on the Gorhambury land, so they clearly, Gorhambury gave SEGRO permission to go and initialise, as it were, to go and enact the planning permission so that it would remain live and then wouldn't fall over. Does that make sense? Yeah. Most people are nodding. I'm going to take that as a yes. Good.
And there's some bits of information missing from this, I think. I read an interview with the leader of the county council where he said that they need the money and there's lots of things they can spend the money on, but we don't know what they're going to spend it on, and we don't know how much money it is or whether it is indeed value for the people of Hertfordshire. So how much has been offered for this land? And are we happy that they are getting the best value for the ratepayers?
That's a great question. Stella, if you want to come in at this point, just wave your hand at me and I'll bring you in as well. But from the way I understand it, there's two things. First of all, the sale of the land, as I understand it, is not in the Hertfordshire County Council budget. So they're not budgeting for it and they're therefore not dependent on it. Of course, every local authority, whatever tier, is desperate to have more cash, right? Because then they can spend it on service, on public services. But it's, as I understand it, it's not in their budget, and therefore they haven't budgeted for it, and therefore it's not something that, you know, if they don't get it, then they can't deliver particular services. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that at the recent cabinet meeting of the Hertfordshire County Council, there was a part A of the meeting and a part B. Part A is a public bit, part B is a private bit. So I was able to go and make a presentation on behalf of residents of St Albans in the public bit, but I wasn't allowed to stay for the private bit. And the private bit is where members of only county councillors, only elected county councillors, hear the private legal advice that the officers have procured, where they talk about the contract terms and conditions. At that meeting, there was an amendment put down by Liberal Democrat county councillors that talked about making sure that all of the conditions related to planning were put in place before the sale of the land was agreed. That amendment was rejected, but the Conservatives at the County Council put in a different amendment which said that they would write to SEGRO to ask that the planning conditions would be adhered to, and collectively all of the councillors agreed to a new term in the agreement, which was that they were going to require, they would put a minimum floor in place in terms of how much money the County Council had to get for that. To the best of my knowledge, that figure isn't public, but certainly based on the private legal advice that the county councillors as a whole saw, they have put in a kind of minimum floor, saying the county council has to achieve at least this much or above before selling it. So I believe that that's kind of legally binding because it's what the county councillors have decided, but I don't know what that figure is. But it has been discussed.
The original decision made by Eric Pickles to go back and oversee and overrule the decision making for the community and everyone. Is there any challenge left on that? Because he overruled it on the basis that it was going to be a strategic rail freight terminal. You've already mentioned that Northampton has now, with SEGRO going back in and saying it's road to road and are challenging those stipulations. Is there illegality or a reason why we couldn't challenge Eric Pickles' decision making of that time if they're not doing anything with the railways to make it strategic rail?
It's a good question. As far as, unless anybody can come up with a different answer, my understanding is that we can't. So I have challenged this in Parliament. Once the Secretary of State makes a decision, that decision then can't be appealed, basically. It was the final stage. So when the planning application was first put in, it went to the District Council. The District Council said no. Then it went to an appeal. And then at that point, the Secretary of State called it in, made that decision. That decision is final. I have it in writing and I have it on the parliamentary record that the Secretary of State has said there is now nothing else that I can do. It's in the hands of the landowner, and that is why we're focusing so hard on this question of whether or not the County Council is required or not required in law in order to sell. On the second part of your question about Northampton and the way that they're behaving, so again, as I understand it, SEGRO is effectively flouting the conditions that were put in place to use that location not as a freight interchange at the moment, but they're effectively using it for rail to rail and for delivery units and for Amazon, as Nuala's talked about, because she's been able to go and see it. As I understand it, what SEGRO has said publicly when asked by national newspapers and local newspapers, SEGRO says that its intention is still to link up to the freight interchange. I'm just repeating, I'm not saying whether I believe it or not, I'm just letting you know this is what SEGRO has said. SEGRO has said that it's still their intention to link up to the rail link, but that obviously they've been able to build the actual physical buildings faster than they've been able to put the rail link in, and that's why there's the worry. I have no idea how long it's going to take for them to make that rail link happen, but clearly there's a lot of concern in that community, as there is right here, that if they were to try and flout those conditions, it'd be very difficult for us to try and enforce them, and there'd be a delay until the freight link was actually built. Yeah, I think the stage we're at now is the fundamental question is the ownership of the land. If it's deemed that the legal advice Hertfordshire County Council gets, that the new legal advice says they don't have to sell it, if the Secretary of State then decides that he wants to force the sale of the land, that's the stage at which we would be able to then raise those questions about the freight interchange and everything else. It's a bit, I should have bought a flow chart or something, shouldn't I? I might do that on the way home. Did you have something, Nina?
Just on the Northampton site that I visited on Thursday, they are getting, Network Rail are now connecting the rail line that they've done, and they're different from us. They have both, it's on a loop off the main West Coast main line, and they can enter it south and north, so it makes a lot more sense than ours. I think the figure, it's an astonishing amount that they have to pay. I think it's something like £1,000 a minute for shutting the loop down that they have to pay. And they're closing it for 9 days to do the link. But just having the loop doesn't mean that it actually works. I believe the problem there is capacity. So that because these trains are enormously long, we're talking about 3/4 of a kilometre.
Dear God.
And they're slow and they coming off the line. And Larry can say more about that. But it trying to get that working with passenger, and there's already freight going on those lines, and they don't want to give up their slots. It makes capacity issues quite an issue.
Thank you. Yes, just to compare 3/4 of a kilometre freight train with a 12-car Thameslink service. 12-car Thameslink train is 240 metres long, as opposed to around 750 metres. And a laden train coming off the slow lines and going into a very tight curve in order to access the dive under and then into the rail freight terminal reception siding. I think Network Rail estimated its maximum speed at about 40-45 miles an hour. That would take some time to clear the slow lines. And bear in mind that the Thameslink programme has been completed since the original applications, so there are now a much higher density of services running along the Midland Main Line than there were when the application was made. Obviously, they should have modelled what the effect would be when the Thameslink programme had been completed. But I think we would want Network Rail to show the modelling that they made and demonstrate that it can have zero effect on existing passenger services. One action that I was intending to take is to find out from my former colleagues at Thameslink if they have been given the information and they've been able to check the modelling and they're satisfied that it isn't going to prejudice existing services. So that's purely relating to access into and out of the rail freight interchange. It doesn't relate, of course, to what we talked about earlier, which is the impact on the tunnels, a separate issue.
Has anybody got the figure for how much was spent originally by both Herts County Council, St Albans District Council and St Stephen's Parish Council on fighting the original application, and what cost has been sunk into it so far?
Good question. The short answer is no. I don't know how much was spent. What I can say on a completely different subject, well, slightly related subject, is that the way that district councils are effectively capped, all district councils in the country are capped in law by the government in terms of how much money they're actually allowed to charge big developers, and that's for big housing estates and also freight terminals and everything else. So when these big companies apply and put in a planning application, district councils around the country aren't allowed to charge the full price of that it's going to cost them to actually process the application, and that means every single person in this room is effectively subsidising really big developers. It's something that I've raised in Parliament. I'm due to have a meeting with Michael Gove in the coming weeks to discuss changing that, because actually here in St Albans we're subsidising big developers to the tune of about £3 million a year.
Yeah, my question was more around how much has been spent fighting it, not allowing it.
Sure.
Sure.
If we were to talk through the process, so the freight terminal put their application into the district council, and the district council would have spent some money processing that application, and they turned it down. There was then an appeal by that company, so the predecessor to Segro, and the district council would have spent some money defending that appeal, and I don't know how much they spent. We could probably find out. I don't know is the answer. After that point, to the best of my knowledge, I'm pretty sure that any parish council that was involved was relying on the goodwill and volunteer time of all of the parish councillors at the time, who would have spent a lot of time and effort looking through the plans, but wouldn't have actually had funds themselves to challenge it, because parish councils simply don't have the scale of funds to challenge an appeal in that way. They also don't have a statutory function in planning law. So what we could look at is, the only amount of money we'd look at is how much money did St Albans District Council spend all those years ago defending an appeal. Beyond that, after that, it went to the Secretary of State, who then made that determination. So at no point has Hertfordshire County Council had to incur costs in fighting this, and the only time the St Albans District Council would have spent money doing it would have been when they were defending the appeal around 2012. We probably have to ask for it. I mean, I wouldn't know where to find it, but I mean, we could probably ask for it, and somebody at the district council would have to start, going through all the papers at the time.
Yeah, a lot of the legal costs were covered by Strife at the time, who at the 2009 inquiry had a barrister that was paid for by Strife, who took donations from the general public. So I don't remember there being expensive barristers paid for by the county, but I might be wrong. But certainly the guy who sat on the inquiry, was paid for by Strife.
Thank you, that's helpful. And the name of that person is being muttered on the front row. Paul someone or other.
He was very good.
Another question over here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just conscious this guy's recording. Are you from Helios now?
Pardon?
I'm just conscious you're recording.
Oh, I'm Jez Levy's son, councillor.
Okay. Careful what I say then. So when Eric Pickles made the decision...
It is a public meeting and we don't know who is already in the room, so
Okay.
only say what you'd like to be reported anywhere in the local paper.
All right. The Localism Act, I thought that sort of gave local communities a say in how local amenities are used, yet the decision to overturn a planning application seems to be conflicting with that. Under the same, I guess this is the same government Eric Pickles was a part of. And has there been any discussion about, local residents putting in the bid, for example, if we know what the price is, or who actually benefits from this venture?
Okay. Lots of bits there, hang on, my thoughts in order. So, first of all, on the Localism Act, it delivered a little bit, but it didn't deliver a great deal. So under the Localism Act, as far as I can remember, it did create the notion that communities could put forward neighbourhood plans, for example. And I know that in many communities, in many parishes around St Albans and around the country, people spend a lot of time and effort drawing up their neighbourhood plans. So they have the legal right to have a neighbourhood plan. Many of you go to the polls and vote whether you want to support the neighbourhood plan, but you depend entirely on the goodwill of a district council to decide whether or not they want to adopt that neighbourhood plan. There is no statutory basis that says it has to be followed. So the Localism Act creates a form of a mechanism for people to inform and give their views, but it doesn't create any legal obligation on any district council anywhere in the country that they have to take that into account. On the planning system as a whole, our planning system is incredibly top-down. So irrespective of the colour of the parliament, every government has a very top-down planning system, and I believe that our planning system is entirely tipped in favour of the developers, and it's tipped very much against communities, and that's why we continue to get applications for the wrong houses in the wrong places without facilities like, you know, GP surgeries and school places and proper roads and all the rest of it. The planning system, I'll try and be really brief about this, even though I could talk about it for hours. It's a top-down housing system where the government has a methodology and it puts all these different bits into the methodology, and it kind of burps out a figure at the end of it and says this is how many houses you need to build. And for St Albans District Council, the government's saying we have to build 14,000 homes over the next 15, 16 years, basically. It's a lot of houses. Around half of those, roughly about sort of between 5,000 and 7,000 of those could be built on brownfield, but the rest have to be built on greenfield, because on greenbelt land, because there isn't any other brownfield land, right? Some of you will know that there's been a lot of debate in Parliament about this recently. Indeed. There were moves by some backbench Conservative MPs to get the government to drop this. There was an announcement by Michael Gove, which I think a lot of people got very excited about, where he said these numbers are no longer going to be mandatory, but they're going to be advisable. So we're going to advise that you build this many houses. It's not going to be a mandatory target anymore. However, whilst he said that, he hasn't actually changed anything in law yet. So the existing system where the government sets top-down housing targets is still very much in place. And the reason he made that announcement was simply to get his backbenchers off his back. So what he's agreed to do instead is to open up a new consultation on something called the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF. And those of you who are involved in parish councils and district council will be very familiar with the NPPF, but there is going to be a consultation on that and how we look at things like housing numbers. So we're waiting for that to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And it becomes, I mean, I completely understand it, but it's very frustrating when the government makes these big, bold announcements, it's going to change everything, and then quite rightly, residents expect that it's going to change overnight, but in fact it was a kind of, it was an announcement of his intention and direction of travel. Nothing has actually changed yet. And I think there's a third part to your question, I've forgotten what it was.
Yeah, can we buy the site ourselves?
Oh, can you buy the site ourselves? Okay, so, again, the answer is no, I think, on the basis that there are 3 different land owners and it counts as greenbelt land. And in planning terms, you can only use greenbelt land for certain things in certain circumstances, right? And so it's only because the government has stepped in and said, right, that bit of land, we want to use it for a freight interchange. The government made that decision, and that's why it can be used for that purpose. If you withdraw that purpose, it returns to being greenbelt land that can only be used for particular reasons. I think maybe in theory it might be possible for residents to put a bid in to buy the land. I don't have any idea how much they'd sell it for, or whether collectively we'd even be able to afford to buy it. But in terms of what we would then do with it, again, it would be restricted in planning law. But I think it's probably unlikely that these 3 sellers would sell the land just for residents. I could be wrong, but I think it's probably not likely and probably not doable given the sums of money involved. We're probably talking several million. I don't know how many million, but probably several million, maybe tens of millions. One at the back.
I believe in the letter that Andy Love sent to the head of the Herts County Council, the leader of the Herts County Council, there was some mention of a covenant. When County Council acquired that land, I believe there's a covenant set on it. What are the conditions on that covenant and how can they be changed, if they can be changed?
Yeah, sure. So I've heard this said too, and I am looking into it. So my answer may change once I've looked into it a little bit more. My understanding is that when Hertfordshire County Council bought the land, there was a general understanding that the purpose of buying the land was to preserve it and to keep it for community use and to keep it as greenbelt. What is not clear to me was whether that purpose was actually written into the covenant. So if that purpose was not written into the covenant, then that purpose, in terms of the purpose of the buying the land, has not been established in law, and that comes back to the question that Dave was asking about a judicial review, because if the purpose of buying the land had been written into the covenant, then you could argue in a court of law that the purpose was being ignored by the public authority trying to sell it. But my understanding is that it wasn't explicitly written into the covenant, it was just kind of generally regarded that that's why they were doing it, and that makes it very difficult and harder to argue. But I'll check it out, I will double check it for sure.
Hello, what about the environmental consequences of lights or no lights at Park Street roundabout and the surrounding areas? And also light pollution, noise pollution, air pollution.
I mean, so there's absolutely no doubt that this is going to be
I see a load
people
of
who
light
argue
pollution.
in favour of freight interchanges, wherever they are in the country, argue that they're a good thing for tackling the climate emergency because you should be getting freight off the roads, onto the trains, and that's going to reduce carbon emissions. That's the argument in favour in terms of freight terminals. Go on.
But they're saying there's going to be 202 lorries either coming or going, so that negates that argument.
Sure, so I haven't seen the complete analysis of how this would work. I was about to get to that. I'm trying to present the arguments in both directions so that everyone can get a sort of a full picture. So, you know, there is an argument which is if we want to tackle the climate emergency, we have to get lorries off the road and we have to get things onto rail. And the argument would be that the argument in favour, by some people who argue in favour of this freight interchange, is that by building this freight interchange, you are reducing the number of lorries that would have to drive from London Gateway and from Southampton up to this part of the world, because you've only got lorries going from here north, and the rest of it's going to be done on rail. So that's the argument that some people would put forward. There is a whole separate argument about the local environmental impact. Now, of course, you know, using a piece of greenbelt to do this is one significant problem. As Nuala has highlighted, this is the only freight interchange in the country we think that is being built cheek by jowl with a residential area, which will no doubt have an impact in terms of noise and also, you know, just a really big, physical, ugly building. There is another issue which somebody raised with me in the break, which is that we expect, I think, around 2,000 people to be working on the site, potentially. Nuala says potentially more than 2,000 people working on the site, and many of you will know that unemployment in St Albans is less than 1%. So it's highly unlikely that the people who are going to work there are going to be walking to work. So there's a genuine question about where people are going to come from to work in this place and all the added cars that that's going to bring to the road, and then we're working in shifts as well, which means that we're going to have, it's not just going to be you know, normal commuting time, there'll be various times during the day when the roads are going to be really busy. And that then comes to this question about why we need why the signalisation of Park Street roundabout is so important, because if you've got all of these big HGV lorries and you've got lots of cars going in and out every single day, you know, it doesn't take a genius to work out there's going to be a lot of pressure on our roads. Now, a few months ago, I did write to Hertfordshire County Council and to St Albans District Council, and I asked them to do a review of the impact on the road, because the last time that anybody looked at what the impact on the road was going to be was back in 2014 when the conditions were put in place. And I said, I think this is really out of date, and all of us, I think, probably noticed that the Park Street roundabout has just got busier and busier and busier and keeps getting busier and busier, right?
Yeah.
And they've had a meeting, and I've been told that there isn't any expectation that it'll be that the traffic they estimated back in 2014 is going to be any different for this time round. So that's what they want me to. I told you Panto season is over. Yeah, anyway, so when we're sitting on A414, we can all shout, they're behind you. So, anyway, yeah, so I take your point. There's going to be a huge local environmental impact, both on quality of life and on the ability to get about on the road. It's why, if this does go ahead, we have to work so hard to make sure that those conditions are followed, but it's why we're also fighting so hard to try and stop it in the first place.
Yes.
Hello there, can I ask a question?
1 second, sorry. Just to clarify on the jobs, according to Segro's brochure, which was published in November, they're creating 3,400 jobs on site and 500 jobs off site. And in the construction, 500 construction jobs over 5 years. But when I was at similar sort of numbers, I think it was about 7,000 for Blisworth, for the Northampton site, which is double the area of ours. But there's talk of the Amazon one would be 5,000 jobs in just 1 million square foot thing, and because they work 3 shifts, so they're already looking as if they'll way exceed the job numbers that were spoken about at the DCO, the planning stage. And so the same could, if we get an Amazon warehouse for North London, we could be in a similar thing. And the good jobs, that's one of the other things that HCC was saying, we'll get the jobs. But I mean, how many of us would actually really like to work for Amazon type conditions or want our children doing the same?
Thanks, Stephen.
Hi, it seems to me, we've got 6 or 7 weeks to sort this one out. Has any consideration been given to involving national media or an actual important influencer that we could bankroll to take our case forward? Because the one thing we can guarantee, no county council will want bad publicity.
Indeed.
Great question. I think at the back on the pieces of paper there is an invitation for anybody who has skills in this area to get involved to help that happen. Like most good things in life, it happens when people volunteer and get involved. So if there are people here who want to get involved and get national media coverage, by all means, go for it. As far as I'm concerned, being your MP, it's incumbent on me to try and talk to the decision makers. The decision makers in this case are Hertfordshire County Council. I think we've made a huge step forward in the last few weeks in terms of exposing the fact that we think their legal advice is not sound and forcing them to go and get new legal advice. But I really don't think we should underestimate what a huge step forward that is. It creates a new chink, a new avenue that we haven't had available to us for all these years that have gone by. So let's see what the legal advice says. Let's see if we can get hold of it. That's where I think we need to put a huge amount of pressure. As somebody said to me during the break, as well as asking for the legal advice to be published, we should also ask for the request for legal advice to be published, because any of us know who filled out a poll, depends, the way that you ask the question will often determine the answer, so we need to ask for that as well. And I know that a number of people have asked for a template letter on how to do that, so I think after this meeting, make sure you give your email address to the organisers at the back, and Nuala and others will ensure that either there's a petition that you can sign if your time's short and you'd like to just click a button, but alternatively they might put a template letter together so that you don't have to try and remember everything that's been said on a cold Sunday afternoon, and hopefully we can give you a template letter that you can use. But by all means, if anybody wants to try and get local coverage and national coverage, by all means, write to the local newspaper, write to the Herts Ad. I believe there's another paper being launched in February called the St Albans Times, so you can write to them as well. Yeah.
I've just had mentioned that on the HG free front that one of the figures I stated was misunderstood. When I spoke about 202 movements, that's per hour, and that's the capped rate at peak, the 2 peak morning and 2 peak evening. So if that's the capped rate, the rate at other times could be considerably higher. And so you can just do the maths. And if we're looking at 76, even at the best estimate, 76 containers coming in per train, and it's likely if they have to use a different type of carrier bogie, it could be half of that, with the amount of freight that's coming in by rail, even at the best construction of it, and the amount of lorries going out it's going to be a very small part. That's why we came up with the title "Stop the Fake Rail," because it's like even with the best, with all the wind behind their sails, the amount of road traffic is going to exceed rail traffic considerably.
Thank you. Got a few minutes left. Last bit to ask the questions. I think there's one there, and one here. Who's got our mic?
You missed me out here in the corner.
Oh, and you as well, sorry. Sorry.
That's all right.
I need to get some Specsavers.
Okay, I'll be quick. What is the basis of the planning approval when the local plan hasn't been agreed by St Albans Council?
Shall I take all 2 or 3 in a go and try and answer all at the end? Do you want to whiz around and get all the questions and I'll try and do them all in one go at the end?
How's it going to implement the value of our homes? And are they going to give us compensation like they did with the M25 when it was extended, when it was widened?
With regards to the debate on selling the land, what's Herts County Council's obligations to consider to maximise the people's return? I know there's obviously financial. What other obligations are they bound to make?
Okay. One more at the front. I'll try and do all 4 in one go.
One of the points I raised when they did the public inquiry is that because that rail track is the tightest possible bend, it's going to squeal like mad at night. I'd like to know when it's a surface inversion, which will happen during the summer, how far away will you be able to hear that? My guess is it'll be something like 3 miles.
Well, I heard the gate pub booming from all the way
So,
down the road.
notwithstanding my fairly detailed knowledge of the National Planning Policy Framework, I know nothing about tight bends on trains, I'm afraid. So I'm going to just be really honest and say I'm not going to answer that one, but I'm going to leave that with Larry, who's writing it down, may have something to say about it, and if not, he'll write to Modern Railway magazine, and we'll put that question to them as well. But you have found the limits of my knowledge on trains, I'm afraid. So that's that one done. In terms of the other ones, status of the Planning Commission. So, as you know, the Planning Commission was granted in 2014 by the Secretary of State. A previous version of the local plan, and let's be honest, the local plan's been a big problem in St Albans for a long time under lots of different parties, right? It's just a massive headache. It's the second oldest in the country. On the previous version of the local plan was submitted to the government, which had that area, had the Radlett aerodrome space identified for housing, potentially for up to 2,500 homes. When that was submitted, the government basically said this isn't a valid plan because you haven't consulted with other councils about whether you put that, whether you can put those houses in a different area and you can't put them here. So the district council then resubmitted the local plan by withdrawing that site. Now, one of the challenges we have, as you know, is the government's given us these 14,000 homes, this massive housing target, and said we have to have a freight terminal. There is a very real risk, again, which shows the top-down nature of planning, if the district council submits a plan where it can't show where it's going to build all the houses, and if it did, for example, say, right, we don't want a freight terminal, we want 2,500 homes here, there's a very real risk the planning inspector will turn around and say, you've completely failed to say where you're going to put the houses, you've suggested you're going to build them where there's going to be a freight interchange, therefore your plan fails the hurdle and we're going to withdraw all of your planning powers, and you will no longer have any decision-making power about what houses are built, where they're built, how dense they are, or what they look like. And therefore, that's why the District Council made the decision to withdraw that as a site for housing, to resubmit an outline plan, and now, with that withdrawn, they're going through the process of inviting people who do own areas of land to submit those as potential places for housing. So hopefully that answers the question. The second one, the value of homes and compensation, it's a completely legitimate question, and as far as I'm aware, it wasn't taken into account at all. I think the issue we have here is that, as Nuala said before, the vast majority, if not all of the other freight interchanges in the country have been built in areas where there's lots of fields, lots of green land, you're always right next to a major motorway, and therefore they probably haven't ever had to take this into consideration before in terms of the proximity to people's homes. So it's a legitimate question, but as far as I'm aware, there isn't anything in the conditions that relates to compensation for local residents. if we ever get to the stage of development consent order, then that's certainly something that we should pick up for sure. And then the third point, if I can read my writing, selling the land, what considerations does the county council have to give to obligations for return for people? So there was a sort of debate about this over the last 12 months or so, which was some people were suggesting that the county council would had an obligation to ensure that the land was used for the best purpose for people and for communities. And that's an arguable point. But as I understand it, in law, the county council is only really obliged to look at, it's their land, and we're arguing at the moment that it's their choice as to whether we want to sell it or not, right? So if Hertfordshire County Council, if the new legal advice says that Hertfordshire County Council doesn't have to sell the land, then it's up to them to then decide whether they want to sell the land and get some money for it, and whether they think that overrides the other amenity value that it provides to the local community in terms of space to, walk your dog and have clean air and all that kind of stuff. But there's nothing in law, I think, that says that Hertfordshire County Council has to do that. There's nothing that says local authorities have to consider the community benefit that comes from owning a piece of land. It's not that clear cut, but you would hope that a public authority would have that in mind, and that's why it's important that we all make our voices heard, so that if the legal advice is that they don't have to sell, that we can persuade Hertfordshire County Council that actually it has more value to us as residents and taxpayers with its current purpose. So that's the current position. I think we're done. Before I hand back to Neela. Before I hand back to Neela, could I just say again a huge thank you to everybody who's put this meeting together. I probably don't know everybody who's been involved, but some of you are running around with microphones, some are organising tea and biscuits, others are taking names at the back, others are sorting out the PowerPoint. So thank you to all of you for organising it, and I'll hand back to Neela. He'll be pleased that there wasn't a fire in the building.
Thank you very much for turning out on what is a really miserable Sunday afternoon. We haven't a lot of time while the negotiations are going on, so we're looking at a couple of months at the very at the very longest, probably shorter than that. So any help that you can do, just make sure that you grab a piece of paper. There's paper here, there's paper at the back. Make sure that you give us your names. Anything you can do, even if you're just happy to make teas and coffees or whatever, please let us know, and then we'll also make sure that you're on database, and anything that comes out that we'll inform you. Okay, and if we can have some help at the end to put chairs and things back. There's nobody coming after us, but we're hoping that we aren't here till 6 and 7 o'clock.
Can I just say, the one thing we very specifically need is anybody who has knowledge of WordPress or any other system that creates websites. If anybody can offer that, we would be very grateful, please.
And the other thing is, in terms of, we're not looking at the moment to have to raise huge amounts of money, although if what David said earlier about judicial review, then it's might be a different matter. But if anyone knows anything about trying to get a bank account set up, and because a lot of banks are now very reluctant to set up, they're quite happy to do it for scammers and things, but for legitimate groups like us, it's quite difficult. So if anyone's got any ideas or any expertise, we'd be very grateful again.
Yeah, I've got some ideas. And that is the end of the live stream. Well, thank you very much.
Someone's left their notes behind, so
get
if
this
anyone
business
recognises
done.
this, it's at the front.
Yeah. Clean up my rubbish. Thank you. Goodbye.